John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com, FanRag Sports NFL. John, Christian McCaffrey, we're going to start looking at draft a little bit more, and Christian McCaffrey is going to be an interesting guy to start talking about. I don't know that he's he's not the same size as a Darren Sproles, but does he fill a similar need to what Darren Sproles does? And if that's the case, would you have taken, knowing what you know about Darren Sproles now, would you have picked him at 14 in a draft if he was available?
No, I wouldn't. Not for Darren, because he's limited. As explosive as he's been, and as good as a football player as he is, and remains, by the way, I can't justify, even knowing what we know today, taking him with the 14th overall pick. But, Christian McCaffrey is a different animal. He's much bigger. He's, scouts at the Combine, I talked to a couple of them. They said he was the best route runner at the Combine. He's a running back. He's running routes better than wide receivers. So if you have an innovative coach who understands the talent they have, right, and can utilize them in different ways, he's so valuable that I could justify taking him with the 14th pick.
Yeah, he's 5'11", 202 pounds, so he's obviously bigger than a guy like Darren Sproles. But so we'll stay there. Do you think Christian McCaffrey at 14 is a good fit for Philadelphia?
Yeah, I think it's a great fit. And in fact, when you were down in spring training, I told Josh and Pete that I would seriously consider taking him at 14 overall. Because he is that kind of difference maker that can help you in so many ways. And we've said the one constant in Howie Roseman to this offseason has been the constant ringing of the bell that you have to build up around Carson Wentz. I don't think you can find a bigger difference maker that could help Carson Wentz more than Christian McCaffrey, simply because he can do so many things. Obviously, he can be the bell cow running back, but he can also be a 3-down running back. And as I said, if you're inventive, you can use him in the slot. You could even use him outside the numbers to create these weird mismatches. A very unique player, and I really think he will be. The Eagles will be deep in conversation about potentially taking him in 14.
Yeah, no, he's a guy that I would like. And at 14, okay, there's a lot of interesting scenarios there. Like if Corey Davis, the wide receiver, or Mike Williams, the wide receiver, are both falling down the board and they're there and McCaffrey's there, does that change your mind at all? Or do you take McCaffrey supersede those two players?
I think he does now after what's happened in free agency. Because Mike Williams, for instance, I don't think he serves a purpose now that you have Alshon Jeffrey. I think Corey Davis, because he's more well-rounded, I think that's a tougher argument because he can fit in pretty much anywhere as a receiver. But you have to be realistic about it as well. And the fact that this team is no longer sort of deficient at that position from a depth standpoint. And the fact that you bring in Jeffrey and Torrey Smith, you still have Jordan Matthews. Whether the fans like it or not, they have to carry Nelson Aguilar for another year. So numbers become a problem with wide receiver. And I just think Christian McCaffrey would be more impactful right away for this team.
John McMullen's with us here, NFL Draft. The corner class is deep. With that being said, do you take a corner at 14 knowing that you can get guys in the second and third round, maybe even deeper, that could help you out right away? Is corner a top need at 14?
Well, it's certainly their top need. There's no question about that. The problem is how things have shaken out. The Sidney Jones injury was huge for the Eagles because he would have been right in that conversation. That would have been his wheelhouse as a pick, probably to go anywhere from 14 to 20, somewhere in that range is where he would have went if he didn't tear his Achilles, and now he's gone. So as deep as the draft is, you have to look at the guys who's worthy of going at 14 overall. Well,
do you think about Jones real quick? Do you think about Sidney Jones in the second round? Do you do like the Cowboys did last year, just draft a guy and stash him?
Yeah, I would seriously think about that in the second round, and certainly in the third round. To get a talent like that, you could start talking about tremendous value. The problem is the Eagles need bodies at that position to have to play right away. And what I was talking about at 14, it is very, very deep at cornerback, but you start to look at who's worthy of going that high. Lattimore's obviously going to be gone. He's not in the conversation. And it starts to get difficult because there aren't a lot of guys who are probably worthy of going at that selection. So I think that Jones injury was really, really a bigger deal than people realize when it comes to the Eagles.
Because of the domino effect.
Exactly. And if you start trying to reach and go after a Conley from Ohio State or someone like that because you need somebody at that position, I'm not sure he's worthy of going number 14.
Which,
in fact,
we just talked about.
Opinion,
we just talked about him because Kuiper had him at 14 in his latest mock draft. And by the way, McShay, who's on at the bottom of the hour, has McCaffrey going to Philly at 14. So obviously, just mock drafts, but names that will be in the mix there.
Yeah, and if I'm looking at those two specific mock drafts, I'm going McCaffrey. I think he's worthy of going at the 14th overall pick. I don't think Conley is. I think that's a need pick. And if the Eagles went in that direction, they're saying not necessarily that it's going to work out poorly, but they're saying we have such a need at this particular position, we're pushing a kid up the board than probably where he should be.
Yeah, the one thing, too, is when Philly started free agency, wide receiver seemingly was like it's got to be done. Corner now seemingly, we know that that's their top need, but because of some depth, maybe they say, all right, we'll target something else in round one, best available, and then start to go maybe corners in that second, third area. How about the fact of defensive end? Is there somebody in this draft at 14 that you would say, if that guy's there at defensive end, they need to take him?
Yeah, same kind of thing. If you look at edge rusher, it's a need. There's no question.
Yes.
Although it's not as big a need because they did bring in Chris Long that could at least hold down the fort for a year or two. So that was a very big key, similar to wide receiver. And it may give a clear indication that they're looking in a different direction. But the kid from Tennessee would be the number one edge rusher that would project to be around 14. And I just, again, I don't see the value there. So the problem with the spot that the Eagles are in is that the positions they need most probably don't have prospects that should go in that particular position. So I think from that standpoint, you have to say, hey, running back is still a need for this team. Even Reuben Foster, somebody like that, fell to the 14th pick. I think if you're the Philadelphia Eagles, you say, hey, Nigel Bradham had a great year last year, and he was better than we all expected, but he's only got 1 year left on his contract. And I think if you can get a difference maker like that, you would have to put that into the conversation. Unfortunately, cornerback and defensive end, I don't see fits at 14. I don't see players good enough to go at that particular position.
Okay, so at 14, if those two don't make sense in terms of fits, if you start to narrow down by process of elimination, where do you target?
Well, my first choice would be McCaffrey, and I think he will be there at 14. He had such an explosive combine that people started to realize. Remember, he was probably a late first-round pick, early second-round pick when we started this process, but he was so good athletically at the combine that people opened their eyes. I think if Foster is there, I think you have to look at him and maybe even more so than McCaffrey if he falls to that particular spot. And then you do have to look at the wide receivers. My concern, Davis hasn't been able to do much because of injury, and John Ross has so much in his history as far as injury goes. That could be a red flag. But if you listen to Howie Roseman and you believe him, and I do, about building up around Carson Wentz, well, that leads me to believe if guys like that talent are there, they're going to seriously consider them. And that's why I lean towards McCaffrey. But those are the kind of names that I think would be in the conversation for Joe Douglas and Howie Roseman at 14 overall.
All right, pretty cool to start talking about the draft here as we're getting closer. April 27th in Philadelphia. Sports Bash, we'll have more details on that. Let's look at some NFL news and notes here. Marshawn Lynch. Okay, according to Barstool Sports, Marshawn Lynch is visiting the Raiders today. Is that just he happened to be kicking the can down the street? Does Marshawn Lynch want to play again? And by the way, that's former Colts punter Pat McAfee at Barstool Sports, who scooped ESPN and everybody else on that one. But he's technically still employed by Seattle, right?
Yeah, he's on the reserve retired list, so he had to get permission from the Seahawks to make the visit, and he got it. So he's clearly interested, and he's clearly talking about coming back and playing for his hometown team. And obviously he's got 2 more years to do that, to play in Oakland if he wants to. And I think if he does want to come back, the Raiders would certainly want him, and the Seahawks would be certainly have no issue trading him. It would probably be a late round pick, maybe a 7th rounder with conditions put on it that could move up depending on playing time and how much yardage he piles up. But, from the Raiders standpoint, I think they should look at this seriously and realize people kind of forget because of how good Marshawn was for a long time in Seattle. That last year was not good. And even before, he was injury plagued, didn't play for most of the second half of the year, but he was not good early when he was playing. And to be out of the game for an entire year at his age and expect him to come back and be the same sort of beast-quake runner, I just don't think that's going to happen.
Does that tell you that he really needed the year off, that he wants to come back, or is entertaining the thought to come back, that his body really needed to take a year off?
It's possible, because he was obviously a tremendously physical runner.
Yeah, I mean,
so
he reminds me, like Marion Barber was a guy who just for like 3 years just blasted you, and then just the tires were flat.
Yeah, he took a beating. There's no question. Just from the way he ran the football, there's probably no running back in the game that took more of a beating than Marshawn Lynch.
Yeah.
So, you could kind of spin it in that direction. But also, if you think about his last number of years in Seattle, he was constantly arguing about money. He was constantly threatening retirement. And it was at that stage where the running back market started to be devalued. And Marshawn was one of those guys who said, look, I'm the star of this team. And he was right. Their entire offense was built on the running game, and sort of everything Russell Wilson was able to accomplish came off that dominating running game. So he was right, but he was always arguing about money. He always wanted to be paid $9-10 million a year, and that became a headache. And I think that's more of the reason why he just said, I'm done. But we'll see. And certainly the physicality of his running style you're probably right. From that point, he probably feels a heck of a lot better than he normally does at this time of year.
Okay. By the way, GM John Schneider, I couldn't think of his name for a second. Seattle GM John Schneider confirmed that the rumors around Richard Sherman are real. So is it a matter of time before he's in New England?
Well, I don't know about that. We have to see first what happens with Malcolm Butler.
It only makes sense that, like, if Richard Sherman gets traded, the team that steps up and takes him is the Patriots.
We always say that. But, Pete Carroll said it at the league meetings, at the spring meetings. He admitted it. So it's been there. The Seahawks are willing to trade him. And it's about sending a message. I wrote about this on FanRag 2 weeks ago. If you go back to last season, there were 2 high-profile incidents where Richard Sherman was on the sideline screaming at defensive coordinator Chris Richard. That was the first one. And then late in the season, they were playing the Rams, and they threw the football from the 1-yard line. And we all know how that worked out in the Super Bowl. And Richard Sherman was criticizing the offensive coordinator, Darrell Bevell, after the game, and he didn't beg off it. And I think the Seahawks are kind of fed up, and this is their message to them. Look, if you want to play for this team, get in line. Don't keep leaving the reservation and talking out of school. So I think from that standpoint, it's got more to do with the Seahawks trying to control a guy who's kind of just popping off a little too much, and Pete Carroll and John Schneider don't like it.
I find this interesting. Rich Cimini over at ESPN said that he thinks the Timmy Jernigan trade yesterday could affect what could happen with Sheldon Richardson, and you wonder if Philadelphia could potentially got in on Richardson over Jernigan, or do you like the move they made anyway, and they wouldn't need to get involved in the Richardson deal? Because if Richardson ends up getting traded for something similar, you start to say, did you make a call there?
Well, it's more money for Richardson, obviously. To me, the interesting part, this is Jernigan's last year, so he was a second-round pick. He makes a decent amount of money. But the Eagles, and one of the reasons, by the way, he's out of Baltimore, it's not that he's a bad player, but the Ravens just gave a ton of money to Brandon Williams. And they realized they were going to lose him in free agency because they couldn't pay 2 interior defensive linemen the kind of money that they think Jernigan's going to get when he gets to the open market. The Eagles just went through that because they already have Fletcher Cox, and they had to deal with Benny Logan, even though it didn't go nearly as high as people expected originally for Benny Logan. He got $8 million a year, I believe, on the 1-year deal. So the Eagles could be in the same situation next year that they were in this year. And the fact that Jernigan might command $8 million, maybe more.
Right.
And then they have to answer the conversation, do we want to pay 2 interior defensive linemen so
you know what happens.
Much money.
They probably, don't be shocked then, maybe if they look that way in the draft early, like, second, third round, right about where they got Logan.
Yeah, it's a possibility. It's far less likely. I think that's one of the reasons they signed him. We might be talking about that this time next year at the draft, them looking on the interior of the defensive line, but it's sort of kicking the can down the road on a difficult decision. And they made it with Logan. They might have to make it again with Jernigan.
Yeah, Jernigan, by the way, the swap of third-round picks, Baltimore got Philly 74. The Ravens send 99 and Jernigan to Philadelphia. It's it's a good deal for Philly just to get for this year, to get somebody in there to replace Logan and not have to use Bo Allen in that role, as we kind of chronicled yesterday. But as you just mentioned, John, if Jernigan's going to be in the same spot that Logan was this year, you might have to start thinking something a little bit more long-term. And Jernigan might have been just the stopgap to say, all right, we need a veteran that can start right away now, and we'll think about the draft in that position next year because we've got too many other issues.
Well, yeah, in a weird way, you want him to play well. You want him to have a big year. But if he does, he's going to cost a ton of money. So it's kind of a a catch-22 for the Eagles unless they can get a team-friendly extension done before the season starts, maybe $4 or $5 million a year, something of that nature. And you never say never with Howie Roseman, but I mean, it's and again, that's one of the reasons Baltimore did not, they didn't say this trade wasn't saying Timmy Jernigan was a bad player. It was just an acknowledgement that we just paid Williams. We're not going to be able to afford him, so let's get some.